Hello, welcome, happy Thursday. I hope you're having a very terrific, thankful Thursday. Today we're talking about APIs. Let me see if I can put it, can I put it on no, sorry, I don't know how to do that. I think we can put a sticker on there at one point, but today we're talking about APIs. Let's see if I can figure out how to do that. Comment. No, this is not it. Okay, I don't know how to do that. But, if I do, here's my sticker. Here we go. If only they had an API that I could build for this, that would really help me out. API. Session. Ask me anything. Okay, we did it. We did it. We made it happen. Strong start. So today we're talking about this API obsession, right? And what that really looks like. So I'm going to give you kind of an intro, and then of course this is an Ask Me Anything session, as I always do. So it's more about what you guys want to talk about, less about what I want to talk about. But I think that the biggest piece of this conversation is around like what is an API and kind of debunking that this is somehow a business strategy. And how that actually works. So with that, I'm Kyler Cheatham. A lot of you always ask me to introduce myself. So I own and manage a solution architecture firm that focuses in specifically heavy industry. So very complex manufacturing, metals, mining, food and beverage, all of those different things. We operate globally. So I've seen a lot of these, especially on the AI integration side. And how that actually works. So we're going to get into that today. I have an outline, as I always do, to make sure that we can kind of go through each piece that I want to make sure you leave with. My goal of this conversation is for you to not have to be gatekept on all of this information and you accidentally buy something that is sold to you with this, amazing API feature, which doesn't mean anything at all, right? There can be a lot of different types of integrations, so that should not be a deciding factor when you actually go into buying something. So that is the goal today. Love to know where you guys are joining me from. As always, it's just about what you know and what I know and sharing that, right? I am not the expert. We are the experts collectively. So I invite you to join the conversation. I'm not always right? So having that ability to do that first. So I see some questions coming in. The first thing I want to do, you guys, is define an API. And I really thought a lot about this before I started this live, because I think it's so misunderstood about how that actually works. So when we say API, right, that is an application programming interface, right? So it's just that. It's basically send me a request in a certain format and I'll give you a kind of response. And the best way that I can think about explaining to you the difference between an API and an integration, an API is like a socket in the wall. It's an electrical socket. And an integration is all of the electrical systems in the house, right? It is apple pie intelligence. I personally love everything there's to love about apple pie, so definitely feel that. So if we think about ordering something at a restaurant, and the reason I'm kind of, breaking this down is because there's been so much bullshit, honestly, in the industry around APIs, like it's some sort of business strategy. It's not. It's a simple function, right? So if I go to a restaurant and I order, right, I am putting through the request. The waiter is going to bring the request to the kitchen and say, I want apple pie. And then the food, which is the output, is going to come to me. So the waiter is the system, and that's how that essentially works. If he goes and he tells the system, hey, she wants blueberry pie, they're going to bring me blueberry pie. Very easy to kind of mess up in that conversation. And so I think that's the biggest piece of really understanding what an API is. What it's gotten rebranded as is this weird magic, and honestly, it's disturbing to me. If a vendor says rapid integration to me one more time, I'm gonna straight up choose violence and punch them in the face, right? Like, that is not at all how that works, and it's not a core decision maker. It's just a messenger, right? Thank you for the rose. I appreciate all that. So I see the questions. Let's get into it, but I just want to set that baseline. So when we say things like, why is it wrong to be API obsessed? Because it doesn't fix bad data or broken processes. Violent criminal behavior. Okay, sorry. My bad. I will not do that. And I will simply tell my dear vendor friends that that is not the case in any way, shape, or form. So it's just a messenger. It doesn't fix bad data, right? It doesn't fix garbage system logic like we just talked about here. So that's the issue with being API obsessed, is people think it's some sort of solution. How should businesses think about APIs in terms of business value? So an API is often a last resort, right? Because a lot of times it has to be customized. So ideally there would be, an easy integration between two systems that you're running in an architecture. A lot of times that doesn't exist. And so people that aren't as technically inclined sell this plug and play ecosystem. And that's not really going to make any sense unless your data and processes are super solid, right? It just is a way in which you could pass incomplete or incorrect data throughout systems, which could be more of a value decrease than a value driver, right? So let's see. Just had some API connect to talk. Yes, sir. Cobalt platform will love this. So let's see. We just did that one. Sorry. These comments are hard to read. Deloitte put AI tokens into my API so they could bill in real time. And that the hybrid pricing, right, what we talked about last week or on Tuesday, what day is it, is a huge piece where vendors take APIs hostage and they use it as a way to trap clients into these customers or into, lifelong relationships because they own the API, they built it, or they have a custom integration, right, that they built, which is even worse than the API, right? Remember we talked about the light socket versus the whole electrical system. Let's see. APIs will be replaced by MCP servers, I think. I don't know. I feel like that's a leap. What do you guys think about that? So containerized, so no one has to actually integrate or do any system coding. That is absolutely I feel attacked right now. That's not an option, right? For that ability to look at the modern architecture, right? I feel personally attacked right now. My gig is data for carriers connecting to brokers. Don't trade my moat. I spent all day yesterday judging the innovation grants for advanced industry here in the state of Colorado. And if I hear the word moat one more time, I'm not going to do anything violent, right? I think, I would agree with you. I think MCP are for these executive AI platforms. I would agree with you to an extent. I think the modern business isn't able to act on that architecture, right? So, all right. So let's talk a little bit about Bring your kayak and granola. I honestly wish it still was like that more in rural Colorado, but I won't get on my Colorado native train. I promise I won't do that. So let's see. These systems are still exposed through APIs. And the more holes that you create in your architecture, the more exposure you're going to get, right? So that's a huge risk in that situation. But it's going to be a consideration in how you're able to see all of these different things, whether you have a cybersecurity observation dashboard or what that really looks like when from your system architecture standpoint. What is it, a Jeep or a Subaru? Subarus are very prevalent here, but I personally am a Jeep owner. We have 2 Jeeps, so guilty. But I did fly down there, which I got to see the mess that is DIA. That continues to be a mess. Subaru is great. Yeah, the Supes. Not too bad at all. My mom has one. We often called it the silver bullet. So she's a native Coloradoan as well. So let's go through an example of this, right? So I have kind of one of our case studies pulled up. And so many stereotypes. Absolutely. So if we're a large healthcare organization, the reason I pick healthcare is because I've seen a lot of, especially people looking for VC capital or grant funding in the healthcare space. And I think that's so cool because there can be a lot done there in innovation. But we have to remember that the core healthcare systems, whether we're talking about Epic or SAP or anything like that, we have to be able to plug into them. And a lot of times they're like, well, we're just creating an API. And first of all, if you know either of those, good luck with that. But we have to understand what all of these different pieces. Again, got my bills, my kids, don't hurt my moat. So if we have a large healthcare organization and we're trying to modernize by layering in different APIs, right? So the legacy system could be an Epic system that's 30 plus years old. Maybe even we'll give it 20 years old, right? And then they don't want to go in to say, let's replace all of this, because ripping and replacing all of that would be expensive, right? It would be disruptive to their overall profitability. And then lastly, it would be hit their compliance in a heavily regulated industry for sure, right? So they don't replace the core. They decide to just API it, right? Like to just, layer in those things. The issue on that is that the data formats don't match, right? So the old system, a lot of times, especially in healthcare, is Siemens. We talked a lot about Siemens yesterday, so put a pin in that. The old system uses inconsistent codes. I'm looking at you, Cobol, over here. And probably not a lot of people in the organization know how to utilize that. And the business rules, like a lot of times in healthcare, run off of people as opposed to workflows, right? They're not documented. APIs, in that, I hear you on my powerboat and my moat. API pass incomplete or correct data, right? So if we don't have, documentation, right? If we don't have that data flowing, then we're in trouble, right? So in this situation where we say just connect them, it's no problem. The claims are processed at an incorrect scale, right? So we can't essentially get paid. There's you guys and your sure. Okay. I'm going to get back into it. I'm going to give you this example and then I'm going to get back into it. So the customer facing app shows the wrong coverage, all of these different things, so that people can't access all of their, rights in being able to find their medical records. And then the manual workaround, which is a huge thing when it comes to APIs, because people think that you just, set it and forget it. And it's absolutely not like that in any way, shape, or form. I mean, we have a client right now that is where they're outsourcing a lot of what they need in their core software management. It's like, you guys have a ton of integrations to still manage. So there's no way that you're going to do that, right? And Yeah, so I think that's the API worked perfectly in these situations, right? There's nothing wrong with the API. It's functioning correctly. It's the actual systems behind it and the people behind building the strategy that are not functioning correctly. So when we say just API everything, that would mean, like I said in my example, that would mean trying to plug something in, forcing a European plug into an American outlet, right? It's not going to work. It's probably going to electrocute you, to be totally honest, right? So that's the way that those system works. And we'll talk here in a little bit about how those are held hostage too. So let's see. I've got similar problems with legacy machinery running on Siemens. So when it comes to that type of software, I think the hard part is just their market share around that and what they're trying to do to be more relevant because they have the muscle and the money behind them. So I would be interested to see like if you could potentially upgrade or like what type of legacy machinery is it? There's a lot of people that I see trying to enter the marketplace to compete with them. That is so hard just with the market share that they have. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it, right? But it absolutely is. So APIs are turning into MCP servers. We kind of went through that already. They might be, right? But we have to remember what that actually looks like for a modern organization. It's not something that I would say, and I know many of you said, right, that we can see that happening in the next 2 years, right? So let's see. If APIs sit on top of APIs, are we increasing or reducing architectural complexity? Absolutely increasing it, because you'll need to manage how that's passed. So if I'm running a triathlon, right, and I go to run, because I'm a Coloradoan, so I've got my kayak and my Subaru for sure, right? So I go to run, well, usually it's bike. No, usually it's swim, bike, run, right? All of those different transitions are going to take me a certain amount of time because I'm using different equipment. I'm bringing different things with me. I need to approach it differently. And that is essentially if you bring in additional APIs on top of each other that your bike could break, right? And you did an amazing swim, but now your bike is broken, the gear is broken or something like that. And you're not going to complete the race in the amount of time that you said you were going to because of the complexity of the equipment that you needed, right? Let's see. MCP is just an interface layer for AI to use APIs. Well, typically, let's see. The driver company funding us to make MCP for all of these machines. That's really interesting. I'd love to hear more about that. Definitely, if you can DM me too, if you don't want to explain it here. But I think that when we add another layer, and so this brings to the interoperability conversation, right? And why we've seen the growth of those types of platforms like Snowflake and Palantir and things like that. And essentially business intelligence tools, right? They're going to the organization and pulling all of these disparate data sources together. Can that be a helpful tool? For sure, right? That's not so much APIs, but it could work on APIs, right? But all of those data sources need to be managed. So, again, if we're pulling and vacuuming in all of these data points, it doesn't mean they're good data points, right? And so that's the hard part about this conversation that's completely being missed out. It's, APIs don't transform your business into having good data, right? They just connect a lot of bad data together. And so when we see things like, we'll just do an API, it's like, okay, that's fine. But is the system going to be able to give good information so we can make effective business decisions? And that's where we really turn into being able to be informed buyers, which is my goal for all of you, right? When you go into these conversations. And so where we see APIs in real life, I think is a helpful way to showcase what this means, right? So say your weather app, right? Everybody likes their own like weather app type of thing. But it would be like calling the government service and being like, hey, let me get today's forecast, and then trying to figure out what that meant for your area and your county, right? Or your whatever they have in Canada. I can get all of the different geography when it comes to that stuff, but I don't know at the county level. And it would be like, if you are using Stripe to process a retail purchase on Shopify, right? You would be calling in your credit card, right? It's not provinces. I do know provinces, but I don't know that they have a county level after provinces, right? But we'll leave that for the Canadians. So that's kind of what it's like using APIs in real life. Do vendor use API promises as a means to upsell you? I would say that they talk about APIs in an incorrect way. And essentially, they can control who integrates with their system, right? And that's a big misunderstanding with that. So if they don't have integration relationships with certain systems that you utilize that are critical systems, that's going to be a main decision-making factor for us, right? Because we can't. Yes, I asked someone to define what they mean by seamlessly, like specifically. And you need your DevOps team in there, right? Your IT team. It can't be a business decision that you're thinking, oh, I'm just going to be able to take IT out of this and I'll just explain it to them later after we've executed the contracts. Like, that's not what that means, right? Do they promise seamless integration when in fact it is not seamless? And that's a big misunderstanding. So like seamless integration, that's not for a vendor to decide, right? Like it could certainly be seamless, but you'd have to have the business logic, the sequencing, all of those things already figured out. The vendor has no idea what you have, or they shouldn't, right? When it comes to mapping system A to system B, right? Data types, code, all of those different things that you need to be able to attach together. That it could be, right? So they could explain seamless integration. What I asked, like to build upon that, is give an example of two systems that have worked with that, ideally in my industry and my business size, right? Because a lot of teams, like the client I just mentioned, over $1 billion company, they have a whole IT team that oversees integrations. If you're a smaller to medium-sized business and you're not able to monitor those, that can be a big risk to you, right? Only bring shadow IT. Real IT says no too much. Captain No, as I usually call them, right? And there's a reason that they say no, but that conversation should have already happened outside of the selection conversation, right? But, it's not a perfect world we live in, but we would rather know that there's a functional issue with what we're trying to buy. And hell, let the salesperson convince them. That's why I always like to have them there, because they don't want to be sold shit, right? So they need to be able to blow holes through that and ask all of those things. I think when we see marketing integration, we don't understand how that actually works and constitutes real live system mapping within our overall architecture. So when we hear integration, most of the time that I just ignore that, right? So we need to know, in our situation, does it map to the systems that we deem critical for our business to function? That's more what we care about. We don't really listen to any marketing messages because a lot of times they're just bold-faced lies, which is wild to me, right? That could even be a possible thing, but I digress. And so you have to also remember, like, an API is a relationship. So you're going to be talking to your existing system vendors just as much as you're talking to new SaaS vendors. And I think a lot of people just don't really understand that, right? So think of it as like a one-way data push. Like, I pushed everything into this closet over here, and I don't have any plan for how I'm going to organize it or take it out or anything like that, right? It's just there's no mapping involved in that because they don't know what the other system has. So they're over here like, sure, we can push data anywhere, especially if it gets you to sign this contract faster, right? And that's certainly not something that is going to be helpful to you as the business. And that's a big conversation in that piece. So, and I think a big thing that I've heard as well is, sorry, my computer went to sleep on my outline here, is like the native integration conversation. So like they're pre-built and all of these different things. And then you must buy them rather than creating an API yourself. And that to me always is kind of giving away the keys to your business, as I always want you guys to be able to know that. When we have those conversations, right, we need to be able to know that it's in the contracting, and we understand when we can access that API. Because, I mean, if you worked in an SAP environment, right, they love to block data or put guardrails around it that make it more expensive and all of those. And then what tier of the solution is going to get me in that type of ecosystem performance that I want to, right? So if I have an API, is that additional in that? And so what about BTP scope? So do you mean like, what do you mean by BTP? So if we're looking at all of those different things, like what piece of that do you mean? And then we can go. So like if you're talking about SAP in that, or all kinds of different things we could go into there. So just let me know what you're talking about. I would say the other piece that we always need to look out for is the negotiation of the API rights. Like, so we had a client come to us the other day that has a custom integration, right? And that piece of it is going to be a big consideration to what systems they're able to choose, because their SI owns that custom integration, right? And with that custom integration, we need to know we can either break it or they can continue to understand what that means to have a relationship with that vendor in for the greater part of their existence. And that's a hard business strategy to have, right? Because you're so reliant on other people's business. So that's one to really look out for on my list. And then the security piece of it was the other one I wanted to talk about. So the security piece of it is we need to understand like what are the security risks for our own API, especially if we're in, a heavily compliant, heavily regulated industry. Like we talk about aerospace and defense a lot. We talk about a variety of those pieces. So what do leaders need to understand about APIs so they can make good decisions? I would say the less is more, right? Like ideally, we have one core system that's able to do most of the things that we needed to do. That's kind of like hopes and dreams, right? When it comes to architecture, because not every system, especially in today's day and age, can do what we needed to do. And so when we have more specialized systems, we just need to know what the API looks like, own the API on our own, right? And understand how we're managing it in-house through our IT team. And that's a big consideration when it comes to those types of things. I think the third-party connectors and how we operate within our API, right? Are they limiting things like bulk exports or pushing their own security on us? And that's a big consideration in working with those types of people. I think another piece about APIs and making good decisions, especially if you're like looking at bringing in a new system, kind of in this API craziness, is the paywalls, right? And we've talked about kind of the movement in pricing. We just talked to a massive procurement department at a very large business that's like, hey, can you come in and teach us about pricing or things to look in for SaaS contracts? And I think API endpoints are a big consideration in that. So are they locked behind a higher pricing to your target? What does that look like for what you need to be able to do with your system? Because that's the goal, right? That's the point of APIs, is like, hey, I want my own unique architecture because I used A, B, and C systems. And that doesn't always jive with what the vendor wants you to buy. So when they start just saying things like, we have this, but it's on our enterprise plan, so you would have to pay more. You would have to pay more to access your own data. And that's what we see a lot with the SAP, type of conversation about blocking data. How does AI affect the API conversation? I mean, it makes bad data get through your system faster. And that's a really big risk for the organization when we're putting together these types of very secure, heavily trackable, documented architectures. Is, APIs have very little to do with AI, right? They pass the same data, just as like we talk about agents, right? Agents are, especially predictive agents, even generative agents, right? They're going to help to identify patterns. If that pattern isn't there, they're going to make up the pattern, which is where we get, in dangerous waters there. What systems being connected drives the most value? Well, I mean, ERP, MES, CRM, what's the baseline? So I think all of those main core systems need to be connected. I mean, maybe not like an MES to a CRM, but maybe, right? Depends on what you're trying to do there and the type of business that you are. I think that the biggest thing is like you should make those decisions, right? So a lot of times we see heavy API when we have complex manufacturing and things like quality management systems, warehouse management systems. We just had a business looking for capital on a new transportation management, fleet management system, which is very cool. But the question is, like, how does it integrate with an MES system? And a lot of those questions aren't something that they can answer, right? Because they've never done it before. That's going to be my first question: is when have you done it, and what has it looked like? And it doesn't need to be perfect, especially for newer pieces. But that in that system is going to be something that needs to operate. I think on an ERP system, that's a little bit different, because an enterprise resource planning system is the heartbeat of the organization. It's the entire operational system, right? And I know that we look at those pieces as where can we roll out agents in that, is what a big piece of that conversation does. And I know when we look at APIs, it comes in with AI agents a lot of that conversation of like, how do we manage agents? Like, what's platforms are agents managed on? And a lot of that has to do with like, what do you run? Like AWS, Azure, all of those different pieces. And the agents can be, built into those, but you don't build them, right? Somebody else does. And you've got to really map what data you're processing and all of those different things. I think the other conversation to have is many integrations only work when they're in their own ecosystem. And so they might claim to say, yes, we easily integrate if everything you own is SAP, right? Even I guess like the bigger tier one vendors are notorious for this, because a lot of their systems were built by mergers and acquisitions, right? They have bought other things and just tried to slap them together, but they, make the revenue on that. So internally they can put R&D dollars into making those systems more interoperable, right? When does it cross the line into slop and no longer productive? I think very easily, right? Especially, when we go into businesses, a lot of times they can be locked in this like crazy, confusing analysis paralysis, right? Where they have overcomplicated this system, especially in larger organizations. Now we have 5 different teams that are trying to work on one system, but they all work on it differently. And that is going to be where, we produce slop. So that's why I said, like, when we got the question about, like, how do business leaders make more strategic decisions, it's like, well, they don't use a ton of APIs, right? They might be available on paper, but it has to have a business value and a business case around it, right? I have night fears of Steve Ballmer shouting APIs, APIs. I wish they'd stop. Same, right? I think it's more about how you govern the APIs rather than how many you have. Maybe, right? And your ability to do that. And I think that's misrepresented, right? A lot of times is like, just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? And attach all of these different pieces. And then now you're being sold business leaders making strategic decisions. Sometimes, I mean, if their AI agent or digital twin tells them to, I'm sure they can. So it's hard to know, right? But that piece of it, we want the data to be strategic. And I think that's, nobody wants to talk about data because it's not fun and it's not, about connecting and solving problems. But really, it's the currency of the organization. So we have to take it seriously and we have to, make it healthy. The last thing I'll kind of talk about on the watch out side, and then we can go into kind of like how you flip that power dynamic and make sure that you do that, is the fragile exports and those proprietary measures. So many times they're intentionally designed. A lot of these are intentionally designed with proprietary formatting. So the vendor, like we talked about, owns the moment you export, right? They own the migration. And so a lot of that isn't thought about in like intellectual property, because did you build it or did your SI build it or did your vendor build it, or who, really manages that? And so a lot of times that can make our exports really fragile, incomplete, or expensive, right? Like we talked about the paywall situation. So when we're going through that, we want to be able to show exactly what we're going to need to be exporting, or at least around the idea of like what will we need to access from this when, and make sure that we don't have any sort of gates around when we can access our system, our data, and that type of thing. So I think when we look at how you can, opinions on strategic leaders, on stimulants, and being geeked out, good for productivity. That is way outside my wheelhouse. I have no idea. I think it depends on what you're going for there. I wouldn't say anything's good for productivity, right? on that situation, but you're also talking to someone who's completely sober. So that is, you got to know my bias in that conversation. So what can you do to flip this power dynamic, right? Short-term left in the chat. I know it's always me, talking about what was it last week of like you're old but decent. I'm like, oh, thank you so much. At least, when I worry about doing things like going on stage or like having a keynote or something like that, I'm like, nobody in this audience will be as mean to me as the people on the internet. So no worries there. Just let it all go. But so RFPs and contracts, I know, we talk about it all the time. But we must go into it. We've got to have like those show me the API documentation. Like we've got to walk through those. Show me the productivity flows, like failure handling, like what happens if it breaks, and the monitoring that vendors will provide your team. So are they going to support you on making sure this API is healthy, or are they just going to, completely ghost you when it's not going to be, when it's not working, right? And then again, we talk about the negotiation of API rights. And so that's when we get our kind of real big SaaS-based attorneys involved, like no minimum on throughput, no surprise kind of data migration or throttling of like sometimes you can do it here, sometimes you can't do it here. we've got to make sure all of those things are available to you. It's not, the most fun work to go through and redline all of those contracts, but it's wildly, wildly important. So you don't end up, again, with a critical integration that somebody else owns in your business. So somebody else could make the decision to shut off your production line if they so wanted to. I mean, that's probably a big edge case, but it's possible. And you've just got to understand that risk. And we all take that risk every single day when we use SaaS-based systems or, cloud-based systems. That's just how it is. We've gone from owning our architecture to renting it. And that's a big piece of that. So the other thing I would say is avoiding those proprietary integrations, not only like the rights, but making sure that systems they have the standards that are needed for security, and that they don't require like a vendor only connector, something in that stage, or they don't require vendor only support, because that's a lot of times how they're going to get more hours and services out of you. Sometimes those things are unavoidable depending on like how customized your system is or what you're looking to achieve, right? But it needs to be not a surprise to you. It needs to be something that you understand how much it is, how much information you're going to get, and all of that. So, and then lastly on the contracting, and then I'll get to those questions, is what's the exit plan, right? So if you someday, hopefully not today, how will you get all of your information out of this API? Files, all of those things. And we need to know that before you sign. I always say exit ramp on all of your contracts, right? Like how are you going to get out of the system if you decide you like hate it? But, APIs are just the doorways, you guys. The integration is the electric, it's the plumbing and all of that things. But we still need to get all this stuff out of the door of the house in order to move houses, right? What are your thoughts on AI being used to speed up implementations, like system implementations, or like policy implementations? We'll do systems since we're talking about APIs. The practical use case. I think a lot of times like AI can be used for a variety of different things as long as it's monitored, right? So the AI systems can be used to do like things like testing, like going through and mapping an entire system, push this button, push this, tab open, all of those different things, put in a formula here or something like that, numbers and characters. That's what I was looking for, formula, characters. Do all of those different things, right? So that we can see a readout of how that works. We see offshore and testing all the time. And that piece of it is a way to get everything tested quicker and faster and cheaper. Does that mean that's a right way to do it? Depends on the size of the system, depends on the size of the business. I think AI can absolutely be used in the collaborative tools, the project documentation. I've seen a lot of, I just reviewed this week or last week, a new tool for just ERP implementations that's an AI collaborative platform. So they go in and they're able to be there on the entire project, and it uses like a business intelligence kind of process for you to be able to put through a query, like I missed this amount or put together this executive report. And of course, all of those things take intention and documentation. But I think it's certainly a way to be more efficient if you're able to manage to that. I think of it like an intern, right? Sometimes an intern can be helpful. Sometimes they can be more of, a hindrance. Does that mean you shouldn't have an intern? No, right? It just means you have to know what you're managing and you have to help that system be implemented and learned, right? Wait, there's a right way to do it. What about vibe coding into success? Some people do that, right? We have massive clients that, vibe coding gets into their production, breaks something, and IT has to fix it. I always say the bigger the business, the bigger the mess on that side. So there's absolutely vibe coding going into production. The amount of people that are like, that would never happen. It's like, unfortunately, that happens all the time, right? And break something and then IT has to fix it with actual code that we didn't, just guess into. So that's going to be, a big piece of that. I think another way in which you can utilize it in an implementation, I think for like bigger implementations, I'm pretty cautious about using any sort of AI on the actual business strategic approach. You can use it for a variety of collaborative things, right? You could send meeting notes. You could try and deploy surveys for change management or user adoption. Like there's a ton of stuff you could be doing. It just depends on your technical maturity as an organization, your people's comfortability with, getting AI drafted emails, repetitive tasks. Yeah, that's a great way to utilize it. And then we go into like, are you trying to get AI automation into your system? And all of those different pieces. But for you, that has to be intentional, right? It has to be planned and knowing that we're going to utilize certain things for that. I think it always makes me nervous, especially when bigger clients come to us and be like, hey, we're replacing our ERP system. We're going to drastically reduce headcount. It's like, how so? Like, what do you understand what that means? Because an API doesn't reduce headcount, right? Again, it's just the doorway into the bigger house that is the system. It still needs to be opened and managed, and you got to know who's coming in and out of your house. Are they coming in to rob you? Are they coming, what does that mean? And then what's going out of the house? That type of thing. So those pieces are not a business strategy. It's a simple function of the actual system. So, so being able to know that and negotiate them are important. So like, a lot of people that in our world that have MES systems, they need them to connect with a variety of different things because it takes a very sophisticated manufacturing business to have an MES system, because a lot of times an ERP will do that, or a supply chain management system or something like that. But if you need an MES system, then you need to be able to understand how it integrates with your ERP system. So say you have one ERP vendor and you have one MES vendor, they're going to constantly be fighting over this integration because they're trying to get more of your overall software footprint as a business. So you just got to be aware of that, right? When you're working through those things and have the internal knowledge and competencies on your IT team to be able to do that. And a lot of times, again, it's sold as, oh yeah, it plugs right in. It's perfect. You just, turn it on and there you go. And that's not the case whatsoever. If anyone that's ever worked in any sort of business system type of role would understand that is not at all the way that it works. So plug and play is a weird term, honestly, that you think you can even just plug. I mean, even on like a very micro level, who's ever implemented QuickBooks on their own, right? It's a pain in the ass. Like it just is. That's the way that the financial system works, but you got to be able to know when to send invoices, how to get payments in your system, all of those different things. So it certainly cannot go in there and just solve all of these, weird problems that we've said that we need to work on. So I think that's kind of the overview of API. So definitely, as in summary, we're not using it as a sales tactic, and we're certainly not using it as a business strategy. Can you connect two systems together? Sure. Should you? Maybe. Are they going to work? Maybe. Right? Those are big question marks in there to know like what your team has competencies in, who owns the API, right? And who is going to make sure that contract is upheld, and that the API has good hygiene. The more APIs, the more they are to manage. That could be fine for your organization because you're equipped to do that, you're used to do that, but it's not something that we need to just throw around integration. I think that's a big thing for me reviewing these businesses that are asking for capital. Integration, someone said to me, I asked a question, what type of legacy systems do you integrate with? And they're like, integration is everything. It's like, cool, but what type of systems do you integrate with, right? I mean, people, in the SaaS space, and I just want to be so clear, like I think that new SaaS systems are good for our marketplace. I think they, provide, especially if they're built by actual users, they provide an ability to make sure the competition is staying on track, and they give businesses like a really specialized operation piece to invest in. So when we evaluate these types of businesses for funding or just overall advisement in general, we've got to understand that competing against SAP is not a thing for this type of, it's not a thing. It's never going to be a thing. Integrating with SAP could be a thing, right? But you've got to understand that that's not going to be something that they're at all interested in, right? It's like a toxic relationship. They don't like you at all, and that could be okay, right? But also understanding that you only have so much circle of influence in that. Let's see. What about building your own? Like building your own ERP system or building your own APIs? What are we talking about there? If a bank is providing API for free initially, JPM, what's the likelihood that it will remain free? Well, I would never want a free API because I would want to know that somebody's held accountable for doing something correctly, especially in a heavily regulated area of my business like money, right? So that in that situation, I would say it's absolutely not going to remain free, but I also really wouldn't want it to be free. So I would have to know like what you're connecting. A lot of times if they're letting you test it, that's cool, right? But with banking information, that certainly wouldn't be something that I would want to be in a test environment with. I would want to know that this API is managed, I pay for it. They're responsible for making sure my information is correct in that. So let's see. What drives the business to switch systems today? What should actually drive that change? Where's the gap? To switch like bigger core systems? Well, I would say probably the biggest thing is they don't like it, right? And that's not at all a reason to switch, right? That's a lot of times we have conversations with clients in that situation of like, do you not like how it looks? Or did someone start a rumor around the organization that it can't do something? Are you sure it can't do that? Because ripping out software is painful. And executives make that decision, like they're ordering a turkey sandwich for lunch. And that's not at all how it works, especially with, bigger organizations, bigger teams. It's going to be expensive. It's going to be painful, right? You're going to have a lot of disruption in there because people are going to have to learn something, a whole new job. And that's a big consideration in that. I think if they have something critically wrong with they can't do a core function, we cannot ship product. Obviously, that would be a core need for them to be able to do with a new system. So they could potentially bring in a system that allows them to do that integrates with their other architecture, or they could say, we have issues in finance, we have issues in production, we have issues in accounting, which is finance, sorry. They have issues all across their business, so they're going to look at a bigger ERP solution. And sometimes, that still exists for people today. A lot of people think ERP is dead. I think the level of being locked into a big SaaS contract is people are losing tolerance for that because of the fatigue of just the constant fees all the time, right? So ERP, the build question. Okay, let's see. Why not build your own ERP system? It would be wildly complex, right? Some people do have homegrown ERP systems. We see that all the time. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. It just means you better have a hell of an IT team to manage that. Or you got to be small enough to be able to do a modular-based business. But a lot of times when we see things like Odoo or more open source ERP, that can be a hindrance to a small business because they're trying to standardize and grow, right? So Odoo might be a great way to do that, or ERP Next, or whatever else open ERP you want. Microservices is a way to do that. But it's not going to give that same standardization because those modules need to be hooked together. And they can't just bump into each other. They need to pass data effectively through an architecture mapping. And so that's a kind of a misunderstood area of open ERP. I think, building your own ERP system is certainly interesting, especially in a heavily regulated industry if you're able to do that. But sometimes investing in the experts that do it well is going to be the best bang for your buck, right? So if you are a aerospace and defense manufacturer, you want to make sure that the CMMC is certified in that level, and you're able to be at that level of security that you need to be at. So I think that's a big consideration in building versus buying. It's got to be assessed, right? You got to get in there under the hood. What do we need? Not that we found a solution that we want to buy, we want to need it. That's, the tail wagging the dog type of situation. We need to figure out what we got going on now, and that's harder said than done, right? To audit all of your SaaS systems and to understand what your ERP roadmap or transformation roadmap, a lot of people talk about, looks like. That's going to be probably 2 years worth of work, right, up front, to make sure that you're buying the thing that you need to buy if you're going for like a core overarching system. So, and your data is a hot mess. Could it be faster? Sure. Could it be slower? Absolutely. But it needs to be on your terms, not a vendor's terms or anything like that. And being able to see like right where we're at right now, it's like a report card, right? I want to make progress. I want to get an A in math. But I can't do that unless I understand what I'm working with right now, so I know where to improve. And that's usually what we understand in this conversation, is that you've got to know where you are today in order to get to where you want to do. And certainly don't slap a bunch of APIs over that and be like, hey, we're going to just layer these APIs on and make everything connect to everything. Because that is, a big ropes course of a system where now we're popping all over to try and get the right data we need. And we're so confused. We don't even know what the single source of truth of data actually is. And then all of a sudden we've got accounting saying Q2 revenue was X, and then production saying it was Y, and marketing saying it was, X, Y, and Z. And that piece of it is going to lead to a lot of problems within the business. So that's kind of, our thoughts on that. We'll go through a few more things on this on our LinkedIn Live tomorrow. So if you want to join it, you absolutely can. I do these lives usually on Tuesdays and Friday mornings. Because I was reviewing capital grants for the state of Colorado all week, I wasn't able to do Friday morning. So apologies there, but I would definitely catch you next week. If you want me to talk about something specific on these lives, or you have questions, because it's really as unique as your own human DNA is your technology. And if you don't approach it that way, that's how we get taken advantage of. Our technology should benefit our people, our processes, and our overall customers, whether constituents, other businesses are your customers, or a consumer is your customer, right? That's what this is supposed to do, not, be on somebody else's terms and just, 100,000 APIs. Not going to get you there, right? So I appreciate all of your information, your comments here. Definitely DM me if there's something else you want to see. And then I will catch you guys next week.